This is Baltimore GS from gstwins.com. Today we're going to show you how to check the valves on a 91 Suzuki GS500. Remove the seat. Remove the two 12mm bolts from the grab bar. Remove the screws securing the center tail plastic. Remove the two 10mm bolts holding on the side fairings. With the 10mm bolt removed, you pop the side covers out of the two grommets. Remove the two 12mm bolts securing the gas tank. Use a long flat blade screwdriver to turn off the tank petcock. Turn it either direction to the side is off. Remove the 10mm bolt securing the frame petcock. Remove the on and the reserve fuel line from the petcock. Remove the clamps from the fuel lines and feed them through the frame so they hang loosely. Lift up the gas tank gently and remove your vent line. Pull the gas tank from the bike. Use an 18mm deep well socket to remove the spark plugs. This will make the engine easier to turn. If your plugs are old and worn out, this will be a good time to replace them. Remove the four 10mm bolts on the breather. Gently pry up on the breather, being careful not to damage the gasket. If you do damage the gasket, you'll have to replace it. Make sure you don't lose the little breather element when you pull it out. Remove the choke cable to give yourself a little more working space. Remove the six 6mm Allen head bolts securing the cylinder head cover. Gently pry up on your cylinder head cover, being careful not to damage the gasket if you plan to reuse it. Work your way around until you free the gasket. Once the gasket's free of the head, you can pull the cylinder head cover out. Remove the three 7mm bolts holding on this cover over top of the crank. Using a 19mm wrench, rotate the crankshaft until the RT timing mark lines up with this pickup. Make sure you turn in a clockwise direction. With the RT mark on our crankshaft lined up with the pickup, you'll see that our camshaft notches are facing away from each other. We want to rotate the engine another full turn and line up our RT mark again with the camshaft notches facing towards each other for our first measurements. The valve clearances on a GS500 should be checked every 4,000 miles. What's actually happening is, as these camshafts spin, they're pushing open and close a valve that lets the exhaust out of the engine and the fuel into the engine. As these open and close, it slowly wears away at the head and the valve itself, so this clearance gets smaller and smaller. If you do not keep checking these clearances and change the shims to keep the correct clearance, the valve will eventually hang open because it can't close all the way, which leads to a burnt valve. With the RT mark on our crankshaft lined up with the pickup, and our two camshaft notches facing towards each other, we'll measure our right-hand exhaust valve, our right-hand intake valve, and our left-hand intake valve. The specifications are 0.03 to 0.08 millimeters. You can run the exhaust a little bit bigger if you're worried about burning valves. Run them around 0.10 millimeters. So I'll start out here with my biggest feeler gauge, which is 0.076. And does not fit. Does not fit. But it does fit in the right-hand exhaust valve. So we'll go to the next size up I have, which is 0.10. And that barely fits, has a good bit of resistance. So that valve there is still in spec. Let's go smaller. Next size down I have is 0.051. That does not fit. Does not fit. My smallest feeler is 0.038 millimeters. And that doesn't fit on either intake, so both of these intake shims are going to need to be changed. You want to write down your measurements. We'll be using them later to calculate what size shims to replace them with. To measure our left-hand exhaust valve, we need to rotate the crank 360 degrees and line up the RT mark with the two camshaft notches facing away from each other this time. With the RT mark on our crank lined up with the pickup again, and now with our camshaft notches facing away from each other, we can check the left-hand exhaust valve. I'll start with my 0.076 millimeters, which fits in fine, so I'll go up one size bigger to my 0.10 millimeter. And that fits with some resistance, so both of the exhaust valves on this bike are already in spec, and the two intake valves will need to be changed. Now that we've done our measurements, we know that the two intake valves need to be changed. So we'll have to rotate the crankshaft around again and line up our RT mark with the two camshaft notches facing towards each other. Place something in the center of the engine like paper towels or a rag so you don't drop anything down in there while you're removing shims. Rotate the valve shim buckets so you'll be able to access the notch to remove the shims. To remove the shims, we're going to be using a Suzuki valve shim tool to push down the valve shim bucket, a little screwdriver to pop the shim up, and a magnet to pull it out. Use the valve shim tool to compress the valve shim bucket. It may take you a couple tries to get it right. With the valve shim bucket depressed, use your screwdriver in the notch to pry up the shim, and then use your magnet to pull the shim out. Repeat the process for any other shims that need to be changed. On this bike, the left intake and the right intake both need to be adjusted. Both of them had 2.70 millimeter shims in them, and our clearance was less than my smallest feeler gauge, which is 0.03 millimeters. So we want to get a clearance of 0.08. We'll subtract the 0.03 that we could measure, and that tells us we want to decrease our shim size by 0.05 millimeters. So 270 minus the 0.05 would be a 2.65 shim. Since we couldn't actually get our feeler gauge in, we might actually want to use a 2.60 shim to get the correct clearance. After you've done your calculations, you're going to need replacement shims. This is a valve shim kit which includes many different sizes. If you're a casual owner, this is really overkill because it has many sizes you'll never use. Our biggest shim in here was a 2.80, which was already too small, so everything bigger than that is completely useless. On Suzuki shims, the diameter is 29.55 millimeters. Make sure you get the correct size because there are 29 millimeter shims used in Kawasaki's that will make a difference if you put them in the engine. Reinstall your replacement shims, face the number down, and that way you'll be able to read them next time you take them out. You want to make sure you have it centered inside the bucket before you release the bucket. With all our shims installed, we can remove our rag from the oil galley. shims will have a little bit of oil stuck underneath them. You want to rotate the engine multiple times to help push that oil out so we can do an accurate reading when we check our clearances with the new shims. I'm going to realign our RT mark on the crankshaft with the pickup with our two camshaft notches facing in towards each other so we can check to make sure that our new shims give us the correct valve clearance. Now that we have our new shims installed, we want to recheck our clearances. Using the .076mm feeler gauge. It fits. And fits. Go to the next size up, the .10. And that does not fit. And that one does not fit, so we're within spec. With our new shims installed and the proper clearances set, go ahead and clean up all the old gasket material off the cylinder head. Install your gasket in the cylinder head cover. If your old gasket was still soft and pliable, it's okay to reuse. If it was brittle and cracked, you should have replaced it. Place liquid gasket material in the camshaft half moons to ensure a proper seal. Reinstall your cylinder head cover, being careful not to knock the gasket loose as you slide into the frame. The larger notch faces towards the front of the bike. If you knock your gasket loose while you're putting the cylinder head cover in, just work it around the cover until it seats back properly. Once everything's lined up, push down the cylinder head cover to seat it in the liquid gasket material. With our gasket fully seated, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our 6 cylinder head cover bolts. The 4 shorter bolts go into the 4 holes here. They have little gaskets that may have pulled out with the bolt. All of ours stayed in the head, so they're okay. These are actually screwing into the camshaft caps, so you want to be very careful not to over tighten them. The torque on these is 11 foot-pounds. I find it difficult to get a torque wrench into the engine while it's still in the frame, so I just take them down till they're snug like this, and then we'll tighten them up in our next stage. These bolts are a low torque application, 11 foot-pounds to be exact, but since I can't get my torque wrench in here, I like to take it down till it seats, and then just tighten it slightly farther. You want to work in a crisscross manner so you seat the gasket properly. Reinstall the 3 7mm bolts in your crankshaft cover. Reinstall the breather. Careful not to lose the breather element when you put it in. And the 4 10mm bolts that secure it. If your bike has the stock airbox, you'll have a breather tube going between these 2 ports. Since this has a lunch box, that doesn't exist. Reinstall the spark plugs. Reinstall the choke cable in the carburetor. Make sure you seat the spring properly between the 2 points. Once everything's installed, you can lower your gas tank onto the frame. Make sure you run the fuel lines and the vent tubing so they don't get pinched. Route your vacuum hoses and the fuel lines through the frame. Be very careful not to pinch them. Reattach your fuel lines from the gas tank to the petcock. The longer nipple on the gas tank is labeled with an R, that's your reserve, which will run to the farther back nipple labeled reserve on the frame petcock. With all our hoses installed, bolt the petcock back into the frame. Turn the fuel tank petcock back on. When the slot faces straight down, that is on. With all the fuel lines installed and the petcocks turned on, slide the gas tank into position and reinstall the two 12mm bolts. Reinstall the fairings. Reinstall the seat. With everything reinstalled, start your bike and check for leaks. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. For more great GS500 info, go to gstwin.com.